I posted a 7-page handout on George Hegel's Absolute Idealism on Brightspace. I don't want to read the handout to you, but call out a few of the high points, and then you can ask questions about it in our class time. This is going to sound really strange to you. I hope it does. Hegel was a brilliant man who played with terms and did interesting things with them, and actually thought that what he did was true, which is pretty out there. It's hard to believe this is actually true, but it's an amazingly intricate, logically consistent system. As Kierkegaard said, though, it's just you're comical, Hegel, if you think this is actually correct. But Hegel, extremely influential in philosophy, history, theology, even today. So this is going to sound really crazy, but a lot of strange stuff here, but so important to understand what's going on in our culture and theology and philosophy, and even with historians. So Hegel's philosophy, first of all, you should know that he will use the word God, but not like you and I do. When you think of God, I hope you think of a separate being who is not any part of us. He's separate. He's a triune God. Hegel's a panentheist. For him, God is an idea. God is a force who permeates everything, kind of maybe like Star Wars, the force that exists in everything. Hegel thinks that history is this God, this divine force, discovering himself, learning who he is. And of course, to know who he is, you have to have some distance. You have to be both a subject and an object. So first, God is just a subject. And because he's just a subject, he can't know himself. But if God posits his opposite, well, that gets him some separation. And now he can look back on himself and know who he is. And then all of history is this further uncovering and discovering his true identity. And Hegel, because he's a panentheist, thinks all of everything, can be wrapped up and found in God. So all of history is just God trying to figure out who he is and learn about himself. And so the way Hegel went about this, he said, history is governed by this ironclad logic. Logic moves through time and space. Logic is not static. Logic necessarily causes movement and posits its opposite. So he said, God, there's this thesis, but a thesis must posit its opposite, its antithesis, and once it does that, the antithesis and the thesis, they combine and comprise a new higher synthesis. Well, that synthesis becomes a new thesis, which necessarily posits its opposite, and together they form a higher synthesis, and that's how everything develops. So on your handout, he's playing with these triads and categories, but some of them, number one, you see the thesis is the absolute in itself. Opposite would be the absolute for itself. Comprised together in a higher synthesis, the absolute in and for itself. Or the thesis is being, opposite of being is nothingness. They're combined for a higher synthesis into becoming. Or unity, its opposite is otherness. They combine into community. Or universality, its opposite is particularity, and they combine to a higher individuality, or being, acting, and knowing. So that's he takes triads and plays with them. On page 2, see that diagram there, shows how for Hegel, all of history is God discovering who he is. So God is pure spirit. That's the thesis. Spirit posits its opposite, which would be nature. And so you have spirit, then nature, and those two combine into humanity, which is a combination of spirit and nature. So spirit, nature, humanity. Then humanity keeps going and it creates culture. And Hegel has ranked different aspects of culture. A lower form of culture is art. And art is lower because art deals in concrete pictures. It hints at universals, at great ideas, but it can't rise beyond just concrete, specific particulars. Art paints pictures. Ahead of art, you have religion. Religion now knows it's contemplating reality, not just individuals, but it only understands the universals through the particulars. It only understands love through the particular of Jesus. Higher than religion is philosophy, which is Hegel's specialty. Philosophy is where you deal just in abstract concepts. You don't need examples. You don't need illustrations if you're really a sharp thinker. You just deal in pure abstraction. And Hegel thought he was the most brilliant mind there ever was. In fact, he thought that through his mind, Spirit or God had most fully discovered who he was. On page 3 and 4, just some of the things he's playing with. The Trinity, you have a Father, that's the thesis. The Father posits opposite otherness, the Son. Together they are combined and united in the Spirit. On page 4, Father, Son, Spirit headings underneath them. Some of the words, concepts that Hegel played with. Under the fall, he thought the fall, like everything in history, was logically necessary. So in innocence, that's the thesis, God and man in undividuated unity, God's a pure idea. The fall is man positing himself, his own self-consciousness, which is separate from God, necessary to have some separation, some distance. Redemption, then, is God reconciling man to himself as a concrete man with a separate self-consciousness, which occurs in the God-man Jesus. Now, Jesus is not unique. He's not divine. He's not unique. Other humans are similar, but Jesus is he's not an entirely new revelation, but he's the culmination of God's ongoing disclosure in history. He just makes explicitly true what's already true in all men, and the rest of history is just everyone else taking cues from Jesus to acknowledge what's already true about them. Christ must die because, remember, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So what's the opposite is not just a man, but spirit or life dying. So the spirit must become a man, part of nature, and then die. That's the opposite. But because the antithesis, when you hit the opposite, always causes a higher synthesis, spirit must go all the way to the end. It must become a man who dies. But once Jesus dies, that triggers a higher synthesis, which would be resurrection. And Jesus must come back from the dead. Hegel doesn't think all these things actually happened in time and space, but he says they're religious symbols that give us windows onto spirit and what God is doing. So that's weird, right? All that should strike you as really strange and pretty much messed up. It does logically hold together. It's coherent. It just almost certainly does not correspond to reality, right? Who would believe that? A couple payoffs though from Hegel's system that are still with us. His system does emphasize the importance of history. Right, if God is discovering himself and uncovering himself in history, then history really matters. It also is a history of progress, of optimism. Things are getting better. Things are improving. Also, it's a big consequence of Hegel's thought is God himself is in process. So later in this semester, we'll talk briefly about process theism. God is not just transcendent, but God is dipolar. He has got two poles, two opposites. He's transcendent and he's immanent. He starts transcendent, then he posits his opposite and becomes immanent, and he's God's in process with the world because the world's a part of him. And as the world makes progress and grows, so does God. So Hegel's influenced a lot of contemporary theology, process theology, Jürgen Moltmann, Wolfhard Pannenberg, liberation and feminist theologians, Asian theology, really anyone who thinks that the current today, that our current starting point is where we start. Our present context is our starting point from where and how we interpret Scripture. That would be at least influenced by Hegel. Two last things. So Hegel, his point is that spirit, God is spirit, and he posits his opposite, nature, antithesis, and together they become man. Well, following Hegel, there's a philosopher named Ludwig Feuerbach who wrote The Essence of Christianity, and he said, well, Hegel, that's interesting, but maybe you have it upside down, exactly backwards. Maybe God's not projecting us, positing us. Maybe we're projecting God. He said, everyone, when they think about God, they create a God in their own image, in their own likeness. How do you know God's projecting us and we're not projecting him? Feuerbach said, if we were a race of birds, we would project a God with feathers. So Feuerbach, also logically coherent, consistent, right? Just going the opposite way, and challenged the very idea of revelation. And then one more important upside down. Hegel said spirit posits matter, and then together the higher synthesis is humanity. Another philosopher, Karl Marx, said, well, are you sure? Are you sure it's spirit positing matter? What if it's matter positing spirit? So Hegel's thesis, antithesis, that's called the dialectic, right? Because it's a dialogue. It's a two, a thesis, antithesis, dialectic. Hegel had a dialectic of the spirit. The spirit posits its opposite. Marx said, what if it's dialectical materialism? What if it's material positing spirit? And of course, that gave way to a lot of horrors of the 20th century. Everything is material, right? Socialism, communism, Marx, Lenin, and the Russian Revolution. And there is no God. Everything is secular. It's just us, material beings, projecting God. And then still, though, right, progress, optimism. If we do this right in Russia, we can create a utopia, the perfect society. So Hegel, his optimism, his progress was turned on its head by both Feuerbach and then in important ways by Karl Marx, who went the opposite way, but also promising utopia and progress. And boy, was he wrong. So that's a quick summary of a really convoluted, deep philosopher, lots to discuss, and we can talk about them in class. Thanks.